Welcome to Fantasy and Faith, where Muslim storytelling meets myth and magic, weaving faith, history, and imagination into unforgettable worlds. Today I'm joined by my first ever guest, Heba Hallak. Did I say that right?
Yep, that's right.
Heba is a Brazilian Lebanese writer, reader, and lifelong student. You can find Heba on Substack, where she writes the excellent The Humanities Notebook, a publication that tries to make beautiful the experience of being human by looking at literature, language, philosophy, faith, and education. I was recently interviewed by Hiba for her article titled The Muslim's Guide to Writing Fiction. It was only right that I returned the favor, and thus have invited Hiba to join me for this episode. Salam, Sister Hiba. Please introduce yourself to the listeners.
Salam alaikum, Noor, and everyone who's listening. First, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me as your first ever guest. My name is Heba, and I'm the writer behind the Humanities Notebook. As Noor has said, it's a space dedicated to long form essays and educational content on literature, linguistics, history, and Islam, and a lot more. It's also where I hope to publish some of my original fiction in the future, inshallah. A little bit about me. I graduated last year with a BA in English Literature, but I wasn't always a humanities student. I actually started in a different major. I was in the scientific track, pursuing a degree in bioinformatics. And although I was excelling at it, I found no passion there. So I made the switch halfway through. I couldn't see myself dedicating the rest of my academic years and lifetime learning. As an avid reader and writer since a young age, I knew that there was only one right answer as to what my major had to be. I launched the Humanities Notebook about 8 months after graduating, and I found it to be a place where I could continue to learn about the humanities and discovering it while documenting that learning process and sharing it with others who have similar interests. And although my posts can be a little niche, I've come to learn quite a lot since starting, and the community here on Substack has been incredible in that respect. In addition to essays, I write fiction and have been doing so since I was about 12. I like to bounce back and forth between genres. Today, I write mostly mystery, but also some literary fiction and speculative fiction. I don't really have any significant piece of fiction published yet, but I hope to achieve that one day, inshallah.
So, Sister, I'm a subscriber of your newsletter. One of the articles that interested me the most was your article, Are You a Niggle? Reflecting on Tolkien's short Leaf by Niggle. You described Tolkien's Niggle narrative as an allegory of creativity. What drew you to reinterpret this story through the lens of artistic work and motivation?
It was actually a note someone posted here on Substack that was suggesting this interpretation. I read the story immediately after, and it resonated with me. I found that although Nigel was a fictional character, his struggles felt very real, from perfectionism to procrastination to not finding enough time for his creativity. And then when I learned that Tolkien himself faced the same difficulties while writing The Lord of the Rings, Nigel became, in my eyes, an embodiment of Tolkien. And this made me feel not only seen, but also encouraged. Seeing someone so successful battling the same struggles kind of gave me a push. So I wrote this essay because I knew someone else out there might be needing that push. And I was right, because not long after publishing the essay, another writer contacted me, telling me he saw himself in Nigel. And days later, he informed me that he managed to finish a big project he'd been struggling with for some time because he successfully battled those quote unquote creative sins that I discuss in my essay. Leaf by Nigel is truly a powerful short story and one of Tolkien's underrated works. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend that you do.
Thank you. So Nigel in Tolkien's story is burdened by projects he never completes. Do you see parallels in modern writing? Those unfinished drafts or ideas that haunt us? How do we treat them?
Definitely. This is a problem I've discussed with several other writers on Substack and elsewhere. Honestly, if you were to open my Google Drive right now, you'd find that at least 80% of the documents on there are incomplete drafts. But for Nigel, his inability to finish his other projects stems from his obsession over the bigger project, the tree. He's never really satisfied with his painting and he wants to keep adding to it, and so he's never able to finish this one project either. For me, the situation is a little different. The reason I often can't complete my drafts is that whenever I'm well into a story, I begin to lose momentum. As soon as I hit a wall in the plot, I start to feel less confident about it and about my ability to finish. So, in other words, it's a kind of writer's block. Then I come up with a different story idea, which makes a whole other project suddenly more appealing. So I switch. But it's only a matter of time until the same happens with that new story. It's kind of a cycle that I'm stuck in. Is there a way to treat that? I'm sure there is, and I've personally tried a couple of techniques that sometimes work and sometimes don't. And I'd like to point out that the way we treat this problem is highly subjective. What works for me might not work for another writer. Anyway, the first solution I've used is outlining my stories the same way I used to outline my academic essays at university. I'm more of a discovery writer, a pantser as they call it, but I found that when I'm truly stuck and really need to finish a certain piece, I resort to outlining it with the minutest details. And I found it helps. Another method is setting myself a deadline for that project. It adds a sort of urgency to it, which forces me to finish the first draft, even if it's an ugly first draft. And I'm still working it out, and I'd actually love to hear it if you have any other suggestions for how to deal with this issue.
My process is quite similar to yours, where I do an ugly draft, first draft, where I just about getting words onto paper. I'm not worried too much about the form or the sentence structure. And then my second draft, I'll spend more time rewriting. So I think your process is a good one. So Tolkien pits work against pleasure for Nigel. In your view, is that dichotomy still relevant for today's creators? And how can we reconcile it?
I'd say the short answer is yes. Tolkien does a great job at representing the way society generally undervalues creative work, especially when it's unpaid. It's clear that Nigel derives pleasure from his painting, but the people around him don't recognize its value because it doesn't really fall under the conventional idea of labor and productivity. If it's not offering immediate benefit to society, or if it's not producing any financial benefit to the person in question, then it doesn't really matter if it brings them pleasure or not, because it's altogether worthless and a waste of time and resources. But nowadays, even though we see a greater acceptance of art and creative pursuits, uh, there's at least where I live, there's still this idea that art only becomes all the more important if it's making money. For example, I've been volunteering as an editor for a youth led literary magazine for about 7 months now, and the first thing people ask me when I bring it up is whether I'm getting paid. When I tell them I'm not, most of them actually ask me what the point of it is. They don't see the passion and the enjoyment that come with participating in something like that, and it's really sad. So, yes, I'd say that creators today are still dealing with this work/pleasure dichotomy. I mean, we live in an age where virtually any skill can be monetized, and with this constant pressure to be productive all the time, it's easy to feel like our art and hobbies will only be taken seriously when they make money. It's almost as if we have forgotten how to enjoy things for the sake of enjoyment alone. And I actually want to take this opportunity to recommend a very powerful essay by the philosopher Bertrand Russell. It's titled In Praise of Idleness, and he dissects this modern problem we're facing, which is our obsession with productivity and financial reward, and our complete dismissal of rest and entertainment for the sake of entertainment.
I feel that same kind of pressure as well, especially on Substack, where you get this constant barrage of articles and essays saying that you have to monetize, you have to monetize. This is how you do Substack, you have to monetize. So I'm there with you on um, the fact that quite often we're writing for pleasure, and then eventually, hopefully one day, it will turn profitable. But right now, it's enough that we write. So Leaf by Niggle implicitly questions whether creativity is a calling. And I think we've just been talking a bit about that already. A duty, even a curse. Which do you resonate with most in your own writing?
So I'd say all three of them sequentially. Once I realized that writing was what I wanted to do, it went from being a calling to being a kind of duty toward myself, my audience, and toward God. So I've written in my latest essay, for which you were interviewed, The Muslim's Guide to Writing Fiction, about the importance of writing harm and sin free fiction. And that's a measure I like to take not only out of obedience to God and as a way of remaining within what's permissible in my faith, but also out of consideration for my readers and for the legacy that I intend to leave behind me through my writing. But then when I come to terms with this responsibility that I have as a writer, creativity kind of becomes a curse because there's this restlessness that comes with being a creator, the constant self imposed pressure to refine and improve all the time. And even worse, there's this fear that I may never truly do justice to the ideas I carry, because no matter how hard I try, the image in my head is always more perfect than what ends up on the page. And there's also the emotional weight of it, the way that writing forces me to come face to face with my flaws and biases, the way it exposes me to failure and rejection. And I've been rejected quite a few times to know just how badly it can sting. But uh, and since I've tied my writing to a moral and spiritual responsibility, the burden is kind of doubled because it's not just about making something beautiful anymore. It's about ensuring that this beauty doesn't come at the expense of my principles. So in that sense, I'd say creativity is a blessing wrapped in a burden because it calls and then it commands and it consumes you. But despite that, I would never really give it up.
Again, I would echo what you said. It started off as a calling, something that I wanted to do. Um, but then when I committed to writing on a weekly basis, it felt more of a duty that I would do to my listeners and readers to get something out every week. Um, and the cusp bit, it's like if you don't write, it's there in your head and it's buzzing away in your head like an angry bee almost, and um, it's not something you can escape. So I've tried not writing and spend more of my time being miserable then. So writing is in some ways a bit of a curse as well. Like we have to do it. It's not something that we have a choice in. So to my next question, Leaf is compelled by a vision of a tree, yet real world obligations pull him away. How do you nurture creative impulses amid everyday responsibilities?
That's a good question. And not finding enough time to write is something I've talked about with other writers. And on Substack, I've seen all sorts of advice. Some go as far as suggesting that you have to wake up as early as 5 a.m. to get 2 hours of writing done before starting your day. And others recommend the opposite, to stay up at night long after everyone has gone to sleep. But I have a problem with this kind of advice because, if we're being honest, not everyone can afford to sacrifice their sleep, especially when they're juggling multiple responsibilities during the day. And I disagree with writers who insist it has to be one or the other because it frames writing as this kind of sacrificial and elusive privilege. And in other words, insisting that one has to sacrifice their rest in order to write can be very discouraging because, in my opinion, the writing itself is the resting. But an advice that has stuck with me is that given by writers who are mothers, specifically mothers of young kids. In my opinion, they're the ones whose time management is truly tested. And despite the overwhelming responsibility that is taking care of young children, many such mothers still find time to write, and we see some of them finishing whole novels. And that's because they treat writing not as something that you'll magically have time for, but as something that you make time for. And because they don't see it as something that needs long stretches of time to get done, but as something that can be achieved through short bursts of motivation. So, for example, they do it in the 20 minutes it takes for their child to finish eating, or during nap time, or during 10-minute breaks. And it doesn't really matter that this means they only get to write a sentence or two at a time because writing is no longer about meeting a certain word count every day. It becomes about simply showing up, putting in the effort, and working towards building something. Slowly, maybe, but certainly. And I'm not a mother myself, but I do often struggle with time management. So, what I do to make time for my writing is actually a combination of those two suggestions. So, whenever I can, I do wake up early
Yeah.
or stay up late towards finding time to write.
So Tolkien's story gently critiques perfectionism, and you can never fully paint the tree. How do you manage the expectations in your creative work? And building on from the last question, where do you strike a healthy balance? So you've already said that you write in the short bursts in the bits of time that you have spare.
So, if Nigel teaches us anything at all about perfectionism, it's that it stops the job from getting done. So, this happens a lot in my writing because sometimes I'd find myself, like you mentioned, I'd find myself writing a few paragraphs and then I'd have to stop to return and edit. And I found this to be incredibly unhealthy, and some advice from other writers have suggested that instead, I just need to get the first draft done, just keep writing and not look back. And it's been incredibly helpful because I keep repeating to myself now that I can't really edit something that doesn't exist yet. I just have to make it exist first and then I can make it good. And to elaborate a little more on this concept of short bursts of motivation, I found that it kind of helped counter my perfectionism because when I became aware of how limited it is that how limited my time is when I have to write, I just kind of start to dismiss these perfectionist urges. So I just have to put them aside and get the writing done, whatever I can get done in those short bursts. So yeah, I'd say it's been pretty helpful.
Thank you. Across your
Mhm.
writing, there's a recurring theme in resisting the surface level in favor of depth, whether through reading, ancient language, or fasting. What drives you to pursue this depth? Is it your humanities background that makes you want to delve deeper into these topics?
I'd say it's both this and the fact that most of the media we consume today is shallow. And I actually want to bring attention specifically to the short form content that we consume every day on social media. I found that this continuous use of short videos and this kind of technology has made us pretty fast paced. We want short paragraphs so that we don't have to read for 15 minutes or so. And we want short videos because our attention spans have been significantly shortened. We want everything simplified. We just want other people's opinions summarized so that we don't have to actually come up with our own. So we ask for food of thought, but we ask for that food to be already chewed for us. So over time, I became kind of disillusioned with social media and this kind of content. So when I decided to start a blog, I knew that it had to bring something different to what I was used to consuming, something both slower and deeper. And to be honest, before I launched the Humanities Notebook, I was a bit worried that it would have no audience because of the long nature of the posts that I create. But then I discovered Substack, which is quite honestly a whole different world to other online spaces. It's almost as if Substack is this abode for social media exiles. Most people I've met here have either already quit social media or are thinking about it or just complaining about what social media is doing to them. It's incredible, really, and seeing the disillusionment of others has made me feel encouraged about finding my audience because people really are craving more informative and entertaining content that isn't just a couple of seconds or paragraphs long. So they really want to reclaim their attention span. My current articles are typically 15-minute reads, but my latest was about 23 minutes, and I plan on going deeper and deeper into my topics as I progress in my journey. And I'd say it's kind of a countercultural effort of some sorts, a resistance to the status quo.
Yeah. Some stuff does seem to favor long form. Yeah. So, can you walk us through your own creative process from your initial spark of curiosity straight to a finished essay? What are the stages that you go through?
Sure. So usually the first step is finding inspiration somewhere. For my publication, most of my ideas come from two places, Substack and a website called The Electric Typewriter. Well, sometimes it's one note in the former that inspires a whole essay, just like what happened with Are You a Niggle? At other times, I read a full article on Substack and decide to write one which is either a response to it or my own version of it. For example, I've seen several writers on here sharing academic reading recommendations, and I chose to do the same. You can find the first installment of my series of recommendations on my profile. My other source for inspiration, the electric typewriter, is a website compiling hundreds of influential essays that you can read for free. I read a couple during my free hours, and every time I do, I find myself with new ideas for my posts. I also get some inspiration from books that I'm reading and random content online, and even everyday interactions with others. The second step is usually brainstorming and planning. I just open a document and start to type down my ideas, how I plan to open it, what goes in the middle, and how I end it. Sometimes it's just like simple titles and sentence fragments that I use, but when the topic is a little difficult and new to me, I outline with more detail. The researching and planning stage typically takes me about a few days, sometimes a week. Then I take another full week to write the article. But that's not really the standard because there are articles that I've written overnight and some I've written in 2 days. It really depends on the topic and my availability. But but I try to stick to a bi-monthly plan for my publication, publishing 2 articles a month, 2 weeks apart. It gives me enough time to properly study the topic and write it down. But the writing part isn't always glamorous. I mean, I struggle with procrastination and perfectionism all the time, kind of like Niggle. And then comes the editing, which normally takes just a couple of hours. The best case scenario is when only line by line editing is necessary. And then the not so nice scenario is when parts of it needs rewriting. And then the worst case scenario, at least for me, is when I realize that the whole article needs to be restructured. It happens sometimes when a current structure doesn't really serve it well. But yeah, this is generally speaking the process I follow when composing my articles.
You're quite organized. I mean, having a schedule for what articles you're going to do. I mean, I do that for my podcast, but for my writing, it's kind of haphazard. I do things as I feel. A lot of my article ideas come in the moment,
Mm.
and then I write them once I've got the idea fresh in my own mind. So, do you see writing as a part of a broader countercultural movement in the humanities?
I like to think that through my publication, I'm making at least a small contribution to a growing supply of humanities related online content. I think we can all agree that in the traditional academic landscape, the humanities have been on a huge decline. I mean, a quick look at enrollment rates in universities confirms that. For example, when I was doing my BA, I had to witness the temporary closing of two majors, history and philosophy, because there were simply no students applying. I came to hear threats of the English major being halted, but thankfully it didn't happen. And I think this is a situation in many universities worldwide. The interest in technology has skyrocketed in recent times, especially now with the role AI is playing in pretty much every field. And this has kind of culminated in an overall undervaluing of literature and other humanities subjects. But something else I witnessed and during my college days, and which is something that actually gives me a lot of hope, is that most of the literature students in my cohort were previously in other scientific majors. I was in bioinformatics, as I mentioned, but I had close friends who were in biology or biochemistry and even computer science and graphic design. They were all like good students in those majors, but they were drawn to pursue literature instead. So, as we can see, despite the obvious decline in the humanities, there remain those who recognize its importance, those who can see what it is capable of offering, things no science can offer. And then we see the same thing happen online. People on Substack, at least, express this intense need for the empathy and relief and insight that nothing quite like the humanities can provide. People are kind of coming back from this obsession over technology, and I like to believe that I'm at least helping in some way.
Thank you. And then for my last question, have you ever considered translating your interests or your writing to other forms like podcasts or storytelling or video?
So I'm honestly kind of a camera shy person. So I'd say videos and like live streams are kind of off the table, at least for now. But audio storytelling is something that's been on my mind for some time, especially after seeing how many Substack publications also have podcasts, such as yours. Who knows? I might start one someday, inshallah, but I think I'd rather stick to written content only for a little longer while I manage to broaden my
Inshallah.
audience a bit. But when and if I create one, inshallah, you'll be one of my first ever guests.
Inshallah. Well, we'll end it there. Thank you for joining me, Sister Hiba. It's been a pleasure. I hope you've enjoyed the experience. Do you want to tell the listeners what you're currently working on?
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I really did enjoy the experience. It was pretty nice. And sure, I'm actually preparing a new series of posts for Substack. These posts will be documenting my first ever reading of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. I started the Fellowship of the Ring a week ago, and I've decided that every time I finish one part, or one book, as Tolkien names it, I'll be publishing a post where I include my thoughts and feelings, as well as some deeper analysis of what I've read. I hope to do so for all the installments in the series, inshallah. As for my fiction, I'm currently writing a couple of short stories I hope to share with you on
Inshallah.
Substack later this year. So stay tuned, inshallah.
Inshallah. Which So I will share a link in the description for your Substack newsletter. Is there anywhere else where the listeners can follow you?
Well, I really
So
only
social
share my
media, for
creative
instance.
work on Substack. I'm don't really have a creative kind of presence elsewhere, but I have included a link to my LinkedIn on my Substack profile, so you can feel free to share that as well if you want.
Okay, thank you. So thanks for joining us, and thank you for joining Hiba, myself on Fantasy and Faith. And until next time, keep dreaming, keep writing, and let your story shine.